you can mute yourself.
Say it again.
Go on the mute.
Where is that?
G'day everyone. We might make a start. Just trying to keep to time. So I'm just here to keep time and rove the mic around. We've got 4 virtual presentations and then myself. So I will hand over to Simone Pedrini, who's going to lead in the session and then present some of his really awesome work. So cheers.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Can you hear me?
Yep,
is that working fine? Good. So thank you for coming and attending to this symposia. This symposia is going to be around the native seed standards and its role in strengthening the global seed supply chain. The idea for this event came from this series of documents that was published last year as a special issue on the journal Restoration Ecology. And through this series of documents, we tried to break down the native seed supply chain and try to see what are the major bottlenecks that still limits a reliable supply of native seeds for ecological restoration. This series of publications culminates with the paper, The International Principles and Standards for Native Seed, where we outlined what are the major improvements that need to happen to strengthen the native seed supply chain. Go quickly through what do we mean for native seed supply chain, and especially in the context of a broader restoration activities and restoration project, where your goal is to go from an ecosystem that needs to be restored to an ecosystem that is now healthy and resilient. Process usually start with a restoration plan, and if seeds are needed as one of the activities, then the native seed sourcing and procurement plans need to be developed. Then usually goes throughout seed collection from natural population, or if possible, to improve the quantity of seed by seed farming. And then through a series of steps like the seed processing and cleaning, seed quality testing, seed storage, if needed, seed dormancy alleviation, if appropriate, seed enhancement, we'll end with the seeding and delivery of seeds to site. Ultimately, through monitoring and adjusting management, will lead to a restored ecosystem. And this is like to encapsulate the entirety of the native seed supply chain. In my talk, I'm going to talk specifically about the effects of seed quality testing, but then we got Michael, for example, talking about some aspect of the seed dormancy alleviation. Shane is going to talk about some element of seed processing and some emblematic species. And then we got Paul Gibson-Roy and Peggy Orwell. They'll actually break down some of the aspects of the entire seed supply chain in different parts of the world. So the presentation you're going to hear is from me about the cost of native seeds. Then Peggy Orwell is going to talk about the national seed strategy in the United States, this foundation document that underpins the development of the native seed markets within the US, especially in the West. And we'll come back to Australia, and Paul Gibson-Roy will present the results of the Australian Native Seed Survey report that was published last year. And it's got lots of useful information to give us an snapshot, an idea of what's the situation in Australia for native seeds. Then we're going to have Shane Turner, that is here next to me, and he'll talk about this amazing species, Nutsia floribunda, and how seed technology and the seed processing can improve its establishment in the field. And then we'll end with Michael Just, that will present some of his work on some of these rutaceae, very hard to germinate species. So before I'll start my talk, I would like to thank the people that agreed to give their time to present here today, for all of you participating in live in Darwin or remote, and especially to the organizers of this challenging conference, given the delays and the problems of having it in remote. So I will start now with my talk, and it's going to be about the true price or the value of native seeds. As I showed you earlier, this is like my idea of a native seed supply chain. And I'm gonna talk specifically about seed quality testing, a bit of an example of how seed quality testing should be done, but also how seed quality testing affect the price of the seeds. Us as scientists tend to forget that restoration practitioners need to run their project on a budget, at times a very tight budget. And so it's important that we start taking into consideration also the monetary aspects of the restoration, and seeds usually is one of these major components. Looking through the literatures, there's not many published work about what is the cost of native seeds. One of the best citations I can use is from this paper published 10 years ago on Science by Dave Merritt and Kingsley. And the estimate that was given here was an average of $850 per kilo for native seeds. And that was a great number. This has been cited many, many times, but I would like to dig deeper in this number and try to understand a bit more how this number is actually distributed across different species or families or life forms. And also, what is the median prices, not just the average? And then what is the quality of seed lots, and how this quality could and should affect the price of seeds? For this specific study, we selected a series of species. Being part of the Center for Mine Site Restoration, we've got collaboration with various mining companies in Western Australia. So we selected two specifically, Hanson and Carrara, and we've decided to use species that are relevant. So we've got 120 species from the Midwest and 71 from the Swan Coastal Plain. If you look at these species are distributed across the life form, most of them are shrubs, 60%, followed by forbs and trees. And when we look at the family, most of them are Myrtaceae, 22%, followed by the Fabaceae, Canopods, and so on. So now we move to our methods, seed quality. What do we mean for it and how we perform it? The definition of seed quality, we took it from the standards, and it's all those intrinsic attributes of a seed batch that can be given a numeric value. And especially for this exercise, we focus on the purity and the viability test. The two images you can see here, these are like the system I've developed. The ones is like a sort of a paper form that we use when you actually do the scoring of the quality. And the one on the right is an Access data bale that was built ad hoc to collect all this information and be able to analyze them later on. So the first test is seed purity. It's a pretty simple test. You grab a representative sample from a bag of seeds, and then you separate what can be considered a pure seed unit and appears to be a seed from everything else, leaves, twigs, pebbles, and whatnot. And then you weight these two fractions. The proportion between the pure seed unit and the non-seeds will give you the percentage of pure seed unit. In this example, 90%. While at it, now we've got the pure seed unit, what we did here was to get 5 subsample of 50 seeds each and weight each of them. With this information, we can now obtain the weight for 1,000 pure seed unit. In this example, 0.57 grams. So this is the first test, the purity test. Then we move to the next step, the viability test. So we got your pure seed unit, and you run a viability test. There's many ways you can do it. There's a CAT test, tetrazolium, you can do germination, floating test. We've opted to use the X-ray test because we are lucky enough to have an X-ray machine, but also it's much faster and it doesn't damage the seed. In this example, we have obtained a 50% viability. I'll have to point out though, this is mostly a field test and tend sometimes to overestimate the amount of viable seed. Just because they look full, it doesn't mean that necessarily those seeds are viable, but in this case, we'll approximate this number and consider them viable. If you now relate the pure seed unit with the viable seed unit and combine these two numbers, you can obtain the percentage of pure live seed, 72%. So for example, if our bag of seeds was 10 kilos, we are now confident in knowing that 7.2 kilos of those seeds can be considered viable. So that's how we've performed our seed quality testing. Seed price, we've obtained those prices for 150 species, and we've converted all the prices to be presented in dollars per kilo. If the more than one price was available for the same species, then we kept the cheapest price. And the further step in the analysis was to adjust the cost per kilo of the seeds to the pure live seed using the following formula. So we'll take the cost of a kilo of seeds and divide it by the percentage of the pure life seed. So for example, if we got a bag of a kilo of seed that costs $500 and the viability is at 50%, the cost for 1,000 pure life seed would be $1,000. And here a bit of a disclaimer. We couldn't use all the data for our analysis because in some cases, due to very low viability combined with a very high cost, we get some unbelievable number. For example, in Godinia, in one of its Godinias, the purity was 0.2% and the cost was more than $6,000. Combine those two and you end up with like a price of almost $5 million per pure life seed. So we had to remove those outliers. And that left us with 131 species we ran the analysis on. So that said, let's move on to the results. First step, let's see the seed quality of all these 191 seed batches. In general, the purity was pretty good, a median of 98 and an average of 85%. And if you see the purity broken down in different life forms, more or less they tend to be pretty good with an average between 80 and 90. The lowest being the trees at about 76%. If we then adjust it for the viability, we'll see that the quality drops drastically. We've got an average of 56% viability across all the species. And if you look at in the different life forms, the lowest quality in general, it's grasses at 40%, followed by the trees at 46%. If you look in the families, how the quality of each family is, we'll see that usually the Asteraceae, Chenopodiaceae, and Proteaceae are within the average at about 50%, 50-60%, while the Fabaceae tend to be much higher. So all the legumes usually have higher viability, higher than 80%. While it comes to no surprise if you work before with Eucalyptus and Melaleucas and the Mutaceae, in that case the quality is usually very low, around 20% on average, with a median of 15%. Another useful information we can get from this data set comes from this data that we collected about 1,000 pure seed unit weight, because now we can plot all the seed mass distribution of 1,000 seed weight for all the different life forms, as you can see in this graph, or maybe even on families, as in this example. And it's quite interesting to notice that all of the Mutaceae tend to be on the lower seed mass spectrum. Like a nice information that we could get out of this data set. So now let's move on to the results of the seed prices. If you look at the prices they're currently marketed, this is the new numbers we've got. So we can update now the number that was published by Kingsley and Dave Merritt 10 years ago. It's no longer $750, but it's about $1,000 per kilo, with a median price of $500, much lower. And if we look at the different life forms, we see they're all more or less seeds within the same range, but the trees and shrubs tend to be cheaper, about $1,000 or $500. But if you look closely, like the annual forbs and grasses tend to be more expensive than average, so with the forbs being about 2,000 and the grass as well. And that start making me thinking about, if you think about the restoration that's happening right now, revegetation that's happening in Australia, it's mostly focused on trees and shrubs, at least here in Western Australia. And there's not much in the understory species. And that might actually be due to the fact that there's little demand for it, but also because the price of these species are quite high. But coincidentally, those are the species that would be probably easier to put into seed production, because you can set up a seed production area next year and get in 2 years a return on investment because you start getting your seeds ready quickly. And if you look at this graph that was published on the standards, you see that by going into seed farming, you can reduce the seed price by increasing the scalability. Although you might lose a bit of genetic representation of a population, you reduce the damage to the population and increase the production efficiency. So a way to decrease the cost for the annuals, the forbs, and the grasses would be to actually start production for these seeds. If we now look at if we now go back to the original analysis and adjust the cost of seeds for the pure life seed, we see that the new average cost is about $2,500, so 1.5 times higher than it currently is. And if we break it down for the different life forms, we'll see that the grasses are still the more expensive at almost $4,000, while all the other groups tend to be around $2,500, $3,000 per kilo of pure life seed. If we now have a look at the families, it's interesting to see how the Canopodiaceae, but especially the Fabaceae, tend to have like a much lower cost, even when adjusted for viability. However, so far, we've always talked, and everybody's been thinking in price per kilo or price per gram, a certain price per unit weight. However, the more we're looking into it, the more I start to realize that this information is not really that useful for a practitioner. This presenting the price in kilograms doesn't convey those information that are needed. For example, it doesn't take into consideration the size or the weight of the seeds, nor the quality. And at the end of the day, what matters for a restoration practitioner is not how many kilo of seeds are you going to put in the landscape, but the number of plants that you successfully establish. So I think that a more useful way to present and to sell seeds would be using the cost of 1,000 pure live seed. I'll show you now how this number can be calculated. If we go back at our purity and viability example before, we know that we got 72% purity and a weight of 1,000 pure live seeds of about 0.57 grams. If we combine these two information, we can get the average weight for 1,000 pure live seed. With this number and with the cost of the native seed batch originally by kilo converted into the cost per gram and multiplying these two values, we can then obtain the cost for 1,000 pure live seed. In an example, we know that the cost of 1,000 pure live seed would be 86 cents. And I think this information, this way of presenting data will carry more useful information to the practitioner and is a more transparent way to sell seeds. I've done a further exercise to my data set and then tried to get this number, the cost of 1,000 pure live seeds, across all my species. And we see that on average, the cost is about $6.5 per 1,000 pure live seed. And if we break it down across the different families, it's interesting to see how the Fabaceae, they used to be the cheapest before, if you correct them for the size and the quality, all of a sudden tend to be more expensive than all the other groups. And then it's also nice to see the Proteaceae, the seeds all the way up there because they got big seeds and they are very expensive to collect. So this is another kind of interesting information that we could get out of this data set. If we now look among the species type, we'll see that the annuals tend to be cheaper in this term. And then all of the other ones tend to be around the $6 and the $7 cost for 1,000 pure live seed. So that said, that's an example of how try to analyze closely every aspect of the native seed supply chain can improve the efficiency of the seed supply. And there's going to be other presentations after me. Shane is going to talk about processing, and Michael's going to talk about the dormancy alleviation. But overall, we need to start thinking and talking about all of these aspects if we want to ultimately to improve the outcomes. I'll be talking more about this topic next week. We're going to have this workshop. It's going to be based here in Perth. We'll try to make it remote as well. So if you're not from Western Australia and you cannot make it, contact us anyway if you're interested, and we'll see if we can make it work in remote and you can attend to it virtually. So this is my email address. If you want to send me an email for an invitation, I'll see what I can do. Otherwise, just reach out to Michael. He'll be part of it as well, and he can give him some information. That said, I'd like to thank you for your attention. I'd like to thank all these people that helped me in the lab in the last year. And if there's time and there's any question, Michael, I'm here to hear about this.
Simon.
Yes.
You're going to be getting lots of emails in the next couple of days. I'm sure
you
we've
can
got
handle them.
Questions and we've got lots of time. So does anyone have anything they'd like to ask? Yep, we've got one over here.
Hi, Simone. It's Clancy. How
Hi,
are you
Clancy.
going? Thanks for that. I think I'm going to have to watch that again at least 5 more times and probably slow it down for myself so I can soak it all in. I was looking at your calculations and I was trying to understand how provenance factors in to the seed pricing calculations.
Okay, this is a can of worm I've decided not to open just of yet. It's a very big discussion, especially when it comes to seed production, because one of the things that is holding back seed production from happening really is the fact there's no clear definitions of what's local. There's no seed transfer zone. They don't provide clarity to the producers of what they're allowed to sell where. All of this now is based on what's commercially available, but that's what we got. And those seeds, they're all collected within the area of the mine site. But if it was 2 kilometers, 200 kilometers, the information we don't know. And honestly, for this analysis, we decided not to focus too much on them. But that plays a big part of the cost, because if you make your provenance area too small, the cost will explode. If you allow them to be as large as the entire country, the price will drop. But then what are the genetic consequences of that? So it's, I think, another different topic, and I did not take that into consideration in the cost analysis.
Thank you.
Good day, Simon. Steve Field.
Hi, Steve.
I was just wondering, and maybe I missed it somewhere, but how did you arrive at that starting point price?
Oh, I've got the prices from seed suppliers. Literally, I went on the website, see the prices, asked them for quotes, and I've got those prices. That's what the seeds are sold at. And that's why I don't have from all of them. I got for 150, I managed to get those prices. And that's what I'm using. That's how the seeds are actually sold at.
Yeah, I did a similar thing about 12 months ago, just to present to a client. And I found that almost inevitably I could not get the amount or the provenance of whatever I was looking for. It was done as a sort of a survey to find out. Did those sort of questions factor into that?
I didn't necessarily, as I said, right now, I just focused on the price itself, but you're right. Like if you start asking for provenance, some suppliers will have it, some won't. And so, yeah, if I break it down too much, I could never been able to do this, but yeah, it's a good point. And I think Paul is going to talk about this later on his presentation of the native seed survey, because that's one of the issues that emerged from that survey is this lack of information or transparency at times about the seed lots.